All right, in this recording, I'm going to go through a sample problem that is related to using methods and how we can break a program up into modules and work with it that way. In this case, I haven't actually looked ahead at how this problem works, so sometimes that's a good thing. You can kind of see as I think through how it's going to get broken up. So in this one, we're going to let the user enter the height and width of a rectangle, and we're going to use that information to calculate both the area and the perimeter. So it instructs us to divide it up into methods for entering the values, performing the computations, and displaying the results. And then for displaying the results, we need to format them so it looks nice and neat. All right, we're going to go ahead and I've already created a project here. And the first thing I'll do right off the bat, because the point of this lesson and this activity is to work with methods, is I'll start defining the methods that I'm going to need right away. So first of all, I'm going to need a method to display I'll go in order, I guess, that we're going to use them. I'm going to need a method to input the results. And so get a number from the user. And as I'm typing some of this, I will mention that as always, there are going to be multiple ways to solve a problem, different ways you could break this up, different ways you could have your methods work, and it doesn't really matter. It's always a good idea to read the problem carefully, and then if it's an assignment that you're turning in for points, if there is a rubric posted on Canvas, you should take a look at the rubric and make sure that you're meeting all the requirements that way. So first, we're going to have to get a number from the user, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm going to use one method to get the length, and then I'll use the same method to get the width, just by prompting the user differently each time. And then I'm going to calculate the area of a rectangle, and then I'm going to calculate the perimeter. And then I'm going to display the results. And it is a good idea to get in the habit early on in your programming career, programming development, of documenting your code. We call this commenting, so that we know what these methods do. So in this case, I've broken it up into 4 methods for the time being. We'll see if I maybe have to divide that again, or if I end up combining some stuff. But each of these methods is going to be defined as public and static for now, and we'll learn more about those as we go. And then we have to explain what this method returns. And so there are 2 different kinds of methods. There are methods that you can think of as commands, like, hey, go out and do this, and they don't give anything back in return. And then there are methods that are like questions, and that they return something back to us. And so getting a number from the user, the idea of that is to return something to us. And so that's going to give us back, in this case, an int. It could be a double. I'll just use an int for this example. The problem doesn't say whether we should use ints or doubles, and sometimes it's important to distinguish between the two, but in this case it doesn't say, and so I'll just stick with ints. And then the name of the method should be descriptive of what the method does. And I'm going to call this getInput. Okay. Now the error that we get says that, hey, you have defined a method that returns an integer, but your code doesn't return an integer. And so that's a kind of a temporary thing at the moment. I can get rid of it by just by putting in some type of a return. A -1 is a value that programmers use just to indicate, hey, this is obviously this is an error of some kind. This isn't real data, but it gets rid of that little warning message. And so when we look at this header definition, we have, again, public and static, then we have the return type int, and then we have the name or the identifier of the method. And methods in Java, in C#, and Java, incidentally, are distinguished by parentheses. And so the parentheses are where we can pass on any information that is necessary for the method to work. And what I want to do is I want to use the same method to get the length from the user and also the width from the user. So I'm going to give them different instructions in each case. And so what I can do is I can have a parameter that I'll call prompt, where I can say, when I call get input, I can say get input and here's a prompt. Here's what you should say to the user. It'll print that to the user, it'll get their input, and it'll return it back to me as an integer. And so that's called a parameter. The book does a good job talking about parameters and arguments, and many programmers use them interchangeably, and for now I will as well. So that's the kind of the basic, what I would call a stub of that method there. Let's go on to the next one. Public static. The area of a rectangle, this is going to give us back an integer again, and I'll just call it area of rectangle. And again, in parentheses, what information does it need in order to calculate the area? It's going to need an integer that represents the length, and it's going to need an integer that represents the width. And so if we have more than one parameter, we can separate those with commas. But you do have to specify the type for both of them. So even though they're both ints, I still have to put int again that second time. And order counts when you use these. We'll see that later, that the length should be first and the width should be second. It doesn't matter in this calculation, but the order does count. So again, I'll just throw in -1 there so that we get rid of that little warning message. And my next method is going to be public static int perimeter of rectangle. And the method names may seem a little bit clumsy, but it's better to kind of overdo it. You don't want to have a method called x or calculate. If you can be more specific, you should. And especially with variable names, you don't want to have the kind of classic case is having a variable integer x, and if that variable represents something, you should name it appropriately. Sometimes x is a good name for it, but usually it's not. So. And then the last method, now this one is just going to go out and display information for us. It's not going to give us anything back. It's just going to output these results to the screen. And so that's a void. Void means essentially nothing, right? So we'll say display results, and it'll take an integer that is the area, and it'll take an integer that is the perimeter, and it'll display that. Now I don't have to put return anything. It's not going to give me an error because this is a void, has a void return type, so it's not expecting a value to be returned. And so at this point my program should compile and run. It's not going to actually do anything. You can see the console window just kind of pops up and then disappears, but it does run. It compiles. So we've got kind of the basic layout. And now if we jump up to the main method here, we can kind of see how this is going to work. I'm going to say I'm going to need to declare some variables. First of all, any piece of information that my program is going to work with, I need a variable for that. So I have two inputs from the user. They're going to be integers. I'm going to have an integer for I'll call it rectangle length, and I'll put a comma. I'll define these at the same time. Rectangle width. Now I could use length and width, and I've used those down here, and there's no problem with that. But for the sake of clarity and making sure that we're not getting confused between this length and this length, I'm going to name them differently. So I'm just going to call it rectangle length and rectangle width. The little green squiggly line there is not an error. It's a warning saying, hey, you've declared a variable and you haven't done anything with it. It's just kind of notifying you of that in case, sometimes you may declare a variable and then you don't end up using it. You should delete those from your program if they're not necessary. So those are the inputs, and I'm going to use a comment to label those. And then I'm going to have some outputs as well, right? Some calculated data. So I'll have area and I'll have perimeter. I guess I'll stick with the same naming convention here. Rectangle area and rectangle perimeter. And those are outputs, or what we would call calculated data, not input by the user. And I could define all those on the same line, or all of them with commas. I like to break them up, so like things that are related to each other I put on one line. If they're not related, I start a new line. So those are all the variables at the moment that I think we're going to need for this problem. I'm going to have the user enter a length and a width, and then I'm going to use my methods down here to calculate the area and the perimeter, and then I'm going to need to display those. And so the way this is going to work, as we learned in previous lessons, we have to assign values to these, and so we could do things. And in fact, for testing, as we're not going to in the interest of time here, but I could do things like rectangle length equals 3 and rectangle width equals 10, and then I could call the methods and we could test it and see if it works. What we have is, instead of the numeric literal 3, we're going to have input, right? We're going to use our get input method. So I'm going to say get input, and now to get input, it's popping up and reminding me that to get input I have to provide a prompt. And so my prompt is going to be enter the length, right, because this is the length. And I'll just cheat and copy and paste that. Oops. Copy and paste that, and I'll change this one to say width. And so that way I can use the same method for both of them. It's going to say enter the length, and then I'll type it in and it'll give me back a value, and the return value is going to be an integer, and I'm going to assign that to the rectangle length variable. So if a method returns something, we should do something with the data that it gives us back. And in this case, I'm just going to store that data in these variables. And then after we've done that, then I'm going to have and you can see when I assign those, the warnings, the little green warnings, go away. And so now I need to figure out what am I going to do, how am I going to get the area. So I'm going to say rectangle area equals, and I've got a method called area of rectangle, and to get that I need to give it a length and width. So I'm going to say rectangle length, comma, rectangle width. And again, order counts. In this case, the type of math we're doing, it's not going to matter, but in theory the order counts. And then we're going to calculate the rectangle perimeter equals perimeter of rectangle length and rectangle width. Okay, and then last but not least, we're going to display our results. And now when I call this method, I don't need to assign it to anything. I don't have an equal, an assignment statement with an equal symbol there, because it doesn't return anything. It is a void return type. It is essentially a command. Hey, program, go out and do this. Go out and display these results. Now, to display the results, it needs to know what is the area and what is the perimeter. So I have rectangle area and rectangle perimeter. Good. Okay, and I'll run my program again, and whoops, wrong key there. I'll run my program again, and just mostly to verify that it compiled okay. And there's a shortcut control. I do it automatically. I have to look and see what my fingers do. Control-Shift-B builds it or compiles it. And that's a good way to check to see if you have any errors. So my program, the skeleton, I guess you could say, of my program is now done. All I have to do is go and sort of flesh out these different methods. And so I'll just do them in order. The first one is get input. Well, in the get input method, the first thing it needs to do is display the prompt to the user. So we've already learned that. It's console.writeLine prompt. And actually, I should use console.write. I guess, so that the cursor stays on that same line. Console.write prompt. Okay. And then we are going to need to get some input from the user. And we're going to have to convert that, as we have learned. When we get input from the user, it comes to us as a string. So I'm going to need, I like to declare my variables at the top of my method here. So I'm going to have a string called input. and then I'm going to have an integer that I will call value, and the value is going to be after we convert it from a string to an integer. That's going to be our value. And so what I will do here is I'm going to say that our input is equal to console.readLine, and so that's going to read in one line from the user, and it's going to store what they type in this string called input. And this is a good place to run it and see what it does now, because we should start to have something. So it's prompting us for the length. So notice I can type in whatever I want here, and it's going to take it, and we're going to need to kind of fix that. Now, check a common question as we're working through this for beginning programmers is, well, how, you're going to see that if they type in, if they type in non-numeric data, it's going to cause some problems. And for now, we just have to live with that. As we learn more, we can figure out some ways we can solve that or address that so that it's not a problem. Okay, and so the next thing I need to do is I need to convert this this string that they've typed into an integer. And there are a couple different ways to do this. If I'm remembering correctly what the book does, I'm going to try and do it a different way so that you see another way of doing it. I can't remember. I think the book probably parses an integer, so I'm going to use the convert class. So convert I want to convert it to an integer, and turns out there are different sizes of integers. The standard one is a 32-bit integer, and that doesn't matter. Any of the three would be fine for us. It's a question of how much memory they use. But I'm going to say convert.toInteger, and I think we should be able to pass in a string for that. And it looks like it is working, and then we can return that value instead of this -1. And that's an important step. If you forget that, you're going to be getting -1 every time, and you're not going to be able to figure out why. So again, there's not going to be anything showing up here really that's significant, but we can try it and see what happens. So if I type in 5 and 3, it seems to work okay. Let's see what happens if I type in some text. I get this crash. This is called an exception, or what we might call a runtime error. And if this happens, or when this happens, because eventually it will, the Visual Studio is in this debugging mode that is not quite normal. It's almost like the program is kind of suspended or paused, and so we got to stop it from running. So we'll hit the stop button there. And again, we can learn later how to handle that. For now, we just have to be careful when we use our program that we just type in valid data. All right, so that seems to be working, we think, but it's good to check. And so what I want to do up here is I'm going to add some temporary code, and I like to label it as temporary so I know to delete it later. And I'm going to just say console.writeLine length equals, and I'll say plus rectangle length. Excuse my poor typing skills here. And then I'll say WriteLine width equals, I should be making better use of IntelliSense here. There we go. And so that's this isn't going to be the behavior we really want from our program, but it's a good way to just sort of test and see how things are working. And it flashed before we were done because as you have probably learned, and I have forgotten here, we want to make that that console window pause. So I'll just add that read line at the end there. So if I type in 3 for length and 2 for width, it pops up and says that length is equal to 3 and width is equal to 2. So what we've done is we have verified that after those method calls have finished, it does seem to be working, that the rectangle length variable and the rectangle width variable seem to hold appropriate values. And I may want to come back and use that test code later, so I'm not going to delete it. I'm just going to do what we call comment it out. Comment it out so that we can maybe use it later if we want. And if this were an assignment I was turning in, I could come back later and actually delete it. Okay, good. So far so good. The next thing that we need to take a look at, by the way, I'll point out a feature that you may not be aware of called code folding. If I'm done with this input method and I don't want to have to look at it anymore, I can click that little minus symbol and it'll shrink it up. So it'll fold it, so to speak, so that it doesn't take up as much real estate on the screen. So I can see that my next method is area of a rectangle. Now, there may be problems when you don't know what the math is to, what is the formula. Hopefully you know area of a rectangle and perimeter of a rectangle. But if you don't, then you ask your friend Google, and hopefully Google has an answer for you. But area of a rectangle is length times width. And so what I'll do is I'm going to make an integer called area. And I'm going to say area is equal to length times width. Okay. And then again, we need to make sure that we get rid of that. And we say that we're going to return the area. And so now I'm going to come up here, and since I don't have my display results method working yet, I'm going to use this temporary code again, and I will identify it as temporary code, and I'm going to say that area equals rectangle area. Okay, and I'm going to run my program again. Notice that I'm running it frequently. Every time I make any kind of a change to it, I'm going to go ahead and run it again. And the reason for that is if I make an error, if I type in some kind of an error, something that doesn't work, I don't want to find out 10 minutes from now, and then I have to figure out where the error was. I want to find out right away, hey, I messed that up, let's fix it now before I add more to it. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is as I'm testing it, I want to use numbers that make sense to me, that I can figure out if they are correct or not. We call these test cases. And so I typically, because I'm not a mathy type of person, I pick numbers that are easy to work with. If we're calculating the area, I know that if I use a length of 2 and a width of 5, I should get 10, right? 2 times 5 is 10. So if I put in 2 and 5, it says area equals 10. So that's a good sign that our program is probably working the way that we want it to work. So area of rectangle seems like it's okay. I'm going to go ahead and fold that up. And the next one is perimeter of a rectangle. Now the perimeter of a rectangle is length plus the width plus the length plus the width, or length plus width times 2. It doesn't matter how you arrive at the answer as long as you arrive at it. And I will show a shortcut that is, I'm going to show it because you'll see it often if you go looking for code online or for help online. It is not the way I recommend you do it as a beginner, but I can skip the step of calculating it and putting it into a variable, and I can just do the calculation right here in the return statement. Since it's a pretty easy calculation, I'm going to say length plus width times 2. And that actually works fine. For readability, you can never go wrong with more readability, more parentheses to help make things clear. So what this does is it's going to work from the inside out. It's going to add length plus width, and it's going to multiply it times 2, and then it is going to return that back to the place where it was called from. So again, I'll add some space here to see. We're going to say perimeter equals rectangle perimeter. I'm going to run it again. So enter the length. I'll do the same numbers. So if I say 2 and 5, now before I hit this, I should have some sense of what I'm expecting. So I already know that 2 times 5 is going to be 10. And so what perimeter am I going to expect? And you can use the calculator if you can't do the math in your head, but it's 2 plus 5 is 7 times 2 is 14. So what I'm expecting to see is 14, and that is what I have gotten. Now these aren't very thorough test cases. The more complex your formula is, the better job you have to do of testing it and making sure you pick test cases that are going to do a good job. And as an example, if I put in 2 and 2 for the width and I get an area of 4, that's a good sign, but it could be a problem, because if it turns out that I'm adding length and width, I'm still going to get 4, and it's going to look like I got the right answer, and in reality the formula is not working the way it's supposed to. So there is some artistry to how you pick your test cases. All right, I'm going to pause for a second so I don't cough into the microphone, and then I will pick up and we'll display the results. Okay, so the last thing that's left is this method called display results. It's going to output all of this. I've been outputting it as kind of test data or temporary, but the assignment specifically says I need to use a method, and it also says that I need to format I need to format it so it looks nice and in tabs. So I'm going to get rid of this temporary data again. And I'm going to do it, I like to build things up kind of in steps. And so I'm going to start out just by outputting it. I'm going to say console.WriteLine, and I'll say area. And now output area. And then I'll say console.WriteLine, and I'll do the perimeter. And so I'm not going to be accomplishing, oops, it did that because I didn't have a quotation mark there. I was typing a variable name instead of a string literal. I'm not going to really be accomplishing anything significant yet to the user. It's going to look the same now as it did a minute ago. But from a design standpoint, now I've put my output into a separate method, which in part that's what the assignment's asking you to do. But it also, we like to keep things separate like that. We like to separate the user interface from the calculations that we do. So I'm just going to test that because that is a significant change. And so I'll put in 5 and 10 this time. 50 and 30 seem reasonable for those numbers. Again, it worked. And just to be sure that there's nothing funny going on up here, I'm going to now delete my temporary code because I don't need it anymore. I can see my output. Okay, so all of my console.WriteLines and console.ReadLines are happening in these methods, and that is kind of the point. Let me go and fold these up a little bit. These on here. So the first one is going to be the heading area, and that'll be let's see, perimeter's got kind of a lot of characters, so we'll say 15, and then I'll tab it over from there, and then we'll format the area, the number itself, and this one will be negative because it's going to be left justified. And then we have to remember to change if we have concatenations in there, the plus symbol, we need to change those now into commas. Let's see what that gives us. We'll see if we want to clean it up from there. Let's go 4 and 5. That looks pretty good, and we'll see kind of how that works then with perimeter as well. So in fact, I'll just copy and paste that. Okay, not bad. I have an extra space in there after the colon that I need to clean up. So let's just do that and see how it looks. Okay, that looks pretty good. It certainly meets the requirements, which is just to demonstrate that you understand how that tabbing and that width specifier works. So I believe that this problem is finished. I'm just going to peek at the problem again and see if I have forgotten anything. We've got user input, we've got outputting the area and the perimeter, we've got methods for those three things, and we are formatting it in a tabular display. So it looks to me like we are done.